Picture this, a courtroom in downtown Atlanta, packed to the rafters, the air so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. Officer Linda Carter stands there, smug as ever, her grin practically screaming victory, while Daniel Harris, a regular guy with unshakable eyes, has just been slapped with a 10-year sentence for a crime he swears he didn't commit. The judge's gavel slams down like a thunderclap, sealing his fate, or so it seems. Then, out of nowhere, a clerk rushes to the bench, whispering something frantic, and the judge's face turns ghost white. What has happened to flip this case on its head? Who's the real liar in this room? And what secret is about to explode, leaving the whole city reeling? Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, let me know where you're tuning in from and if you're Team Justice all the way. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and buckle up, because you won't believe what's coming next. The courtroom in downtown Atlanta simmered like a pot about to boil over, packed wall-to-wall with spectators, their hushed whispers blending into a low, anxious hum. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the scent of sweat and anticipation as ceiling fans churned lazily overhead. Officer Linda Carter, a wiry 42-year-old veteran cop with a buzz-blonde haircut and a reputation as unyielding as steel, some would say ruthless, stood with her arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at the corners of her thin lips. Her hazel eyes glinted with a predator's confidence. Across the room, Daniel Harris, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a crisp navy suit, stood motionless as the judge's gavel crashed down with a sound like thunder, sentencing him to 10 years in prison for assaulting her. The room buzzed. Some spectators nodded approvingly. Others muttered in quiet outrage. Linda savored her triumph, her smirk widening as she tilted her head slightly, daring anyone to challenge her victory. But Daniel's calm brown eyes held something unspoken, a flicker of defiance, a spark she couldn't extinguish. He stood there, unbowed, his expression unreadable, and it gnawed at her. Then the air shifted. A clerk, her face flushed and her hands trembling, hurried to the judge's bench, clutching a tablet as she whispered urgently. Judge Evelyn Hart, a stern woman with silver hair pulled tight into a bun and piercing gray eyes, scanned the screen, her stern features paling. "Order!" she barked, slamming her gavel again, though the room had already fallen into a stunned, electric silence. Linda's smirk faltered just for a heartbeat. What could unravel this moment she'd orchestrated so carefully? The answer was coming, and it would hit harder than a Georgia summer storm. 3 weeks earlier, the sun sank low over Atlanta's upscale Buckhead district, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson as it dipped behind the sleek high-rises and boutique storefronts. Daniel Harris, a 38-year-old entrepreneur with a tech startup that had just landed a major contract, gripped the wheel of his gleaming black sedan. The engine purred smoothly as he eased through the evening traffic, his tailored navy jacket hugging his broad shoulders. His close-cropped hair framed a face etched with quiet determination, softened only by the faint hum of jazz drifting from the radio, a Miles Davis track he loved after a long day. He was just a man heading home to his wife, Elena, a passionate middle school teacher, and their 8-year-old daughter, Mia, the light of his life. "Daddy, you're my superhero," Mia would say, her gap-toothed grin lighting up his world. Tonight, he'd promised her a bedtime story, and he smiled at the thought. But trouble was lurking, coiled and ready to strike. Officer Linda Carter sat in her patrol car, parked in the shadow of a boutique with frosted glass windows, her fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on the steering wheel. Her buzz-blonde hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and her hazel eyes swept the road like a hawk hunting prey. 15 years on the force had forged her into something hard-edged, her badge both a shield and a cudgel. She carried a chip on her shoulder, a grudge born years ago when a promotion slipped through her fingers. Whispers in the precinct had called her too soft, a slight she'd spent every day since disproving with a vengeance. Men like Daniel, successful, composed, unafraid of her gaze, stoked that old fire. They didn't grovel or shrink, and it infuriated her. When Daniel slowed at a stoplight, Linda flicked on her headlights and pulled alongside him, her window already rolling down. "Got a broken taillight, sir," she snapped, her voice sharp and her lips curling into a smirk, though she hadn't even glanced at his car. Daniel turned his head, meeting her stare with steady eyes. "I don't think so, officer. I had it serviced last week," he replied, his tone even, polite, but unyielding. Linda's jaw tightened. She hated his calm, hated how he didn't flinch under her scrutiny. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her voice cutting through the evening air like a whip. Daniel exhaled softly, a sigh of recognition. He'd danced this dance before, countless stops in his own neighborhood, always for looking suspicious in a suit and a nice car. He stepped out, standing tall at 6 feet 2 inches, his hands visible, his suit crisp against the fading light. "Can I ask what this is about?" he said, his voice steady as granite. Linda squared her shoulders, her wiry frame taut with irritation. "You're in a high-crime area, driving slow, looking like you don't belong. I need to see some ID." It was a flimsy lie. Buckhead was no gang-riddled slum, but she didn't care. To her, a black man in a luxury sedan was a challenge, a threat to her authority. Daniel handed over his license, his patience fraying but still holding. Linda snatched it, barely glancing at the name, Daniel Harris, before tossing it carelessly onto her cruiser's hood. "Sure you do," she muttered, her sneer widening. A small crowd began to gather across the street, drawn by the flashing lights. Phones emerged from pockets, recording as whispers turned to murmurs. Linda noticed, and it fueled her, made her chest puff out a little more. "Hands on the car," she snapped, stepping closer. Daniel complied, placing his palms on the sedan's warm hood, his jaw tight, but his breathing steady. Without warning, Linda grabbed his wrist, twisting it hard behind his back, her nails digging into his skin as she slapped cuffs on him. "You're resisting," she hissed, though he hadn't moved an inch. The crowd grew louder. Some voices booed in disapproval. Others cheered her on. "Get him, officer," a man shouted from the sidelines. Linda shoved Daniel into the back of her cruiser, slamming the door with a flourish. "Suspicious behavior. Possible burglary suspect," she announced to the onlookers, her smirk returning as she soaked in the mixed reactions. It was pure theater, and she was the star, oblivious to the phones capturing every second. At the precinct, Daniel was booked with mechanical efficiency, his fingerprints smudging ink onto a card, his mugshot taken under harsh fluorescent lights. His dignity remained intact despite the lies scrawled in Linda's report. Subject resisted arrest, displayed aggressive behavior. She handed him off to a bored desk sergeant with a mocking, "Enjoy your night, tough guy," before striding out, her boots clicking sharply on the tile floor. In the holding cell, Daniel leaned against the cold bars, the metal biting into his back. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He'd seen the phone's recording, heard the crowd's murmurs of dissent. Linda thought she'd won this round, but she'd just lit the match. He knew how to play this game better than she ever would. The next morning, Daniel sat in his living room, the bruises from Linda's rough arrest throbbing under his shirt. Elena, her slender frame tense with worry, handed him a cold pack, her fierce brown eyes searching his face. "You sure about this, Dan?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with steel. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen where his dashcam footage looped. Linda slamming him against the sedan, her sneer clear as day. A hidden camera in his car, installed after too many routine stops, had caught more, her muttering under her breath. "This one's going to learn his place." It was a gold mine, and he knew it. "It's the only way," he said, his fingers hovering over the upload button. But a flicker of doubt crept in. Mia's voice echoed in his mind. "Why did they take you, Daddy?" He hesitated, then pressed upload. The video soared into the digital ether, a spark about to ignite a firestorm. Within hours, it exploded, 50,000 views, then 100,000, then 500,000. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Daniel and hashtag Stop Racist Cops trended across platforms. A 23-year-old activist named Jamal Carter, no relation to Linda, picked up the video, his fiery tweets rallying supporters. "This is our fight too. Daniel Harris is every one of us." By noon the next day, Atlanta buzzed with outrage. News vans camped outside the precinct, reporters shouting questions at stone-faced officers. Daniel stood on his porch, watching the chaos unfold on his phone as a local anchor broke the story. Officer Linda Carter suspended pending investigation after viral video shows excessive force. Elena squeezed his hand, her smile cautious but hopeful. "Maybe this will change something," she said. For a moment, he let himself believe it too. Linda wasn't done. She seethed in her cramped apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the midday sun. Her suspension notice crumpled on the kitchen counter next to a half-empty coffee mug. Her phone buzzed incessantly, taunts from old colleagues, some gleeful, others smug. "Guess you're not untouchable after all, Carter." She ignored them, grabbing her phone and dialing a number she hadn't used in months. Deputy Chief Victor Rollins, a barrel-chested man with a graying mustache and a reputation for bending rules to fit his needs. "Victor, it's me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "That Harris punk's trying to bury me. I need a favor." Victor's gravelly laugh crackled through the line. "What's in it for me, Linda?" She smirked, leaning against the counter. "A clean slate on that IA mess last year, the one with the missing evidence. You owe me." He paused, then growled, "Deal. What's the play?" That night, under a moonless sky, Linda slipped out of her apartment, her boots silent on the pavement. She drove to Daniel's quiet street, parking a block away before creeping toward his sedan in the driveway. Popping the trunk with a gloved hand, she paused, catching her reflection in the car window, her eyes hard, her mouth a tight line. "Think you're smarter than me, Harris?" she muttered. "Watch this." She tucked a stolen gun, a .38 revolver lifted from an evidence locker, beneath the spare tire, a ticking bomb he'd never see coming. She shut the trunk with a soft thud, her pulse steady, her mind racing with the next steps. Back in her apartment, she dialed an anonymous tip line, her voice disguised with a cheap burner phone. "Check Daniel Harris's car, black sedan, Peachtree Lane. He's armed, dangerous, probably dealing." She hung up, a cold smile spreading across her face as she poured herself another coffee. Checkmate. Daniel woke to sunlight streaming through his curtains, his phone buzzing with notifications. The video had hit 300,000 views overnight. He allowed himself a small grin, thinking the tide had turned. Mia bounded into the room, her braids bouncing as she climbed onto the couch. "Daddy, are you famous now?" she asked, her eyes wide. He chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not quite, kiddo." But as he stepped outside to grab the morning paper, the world tilted. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until 3 squad cars screeched into his driveway, tires kicking up gravel. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, shouting, "Hands up, Harris!" Daniel froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as Mia peeked through the window, her face crumpling. An officer yanked open his trunk, pulling out the revolver with a triumphant grunt. "That's not mine," Daniel said, his voice steady but his mind racing. The lead cop, a burly man with a buzz cut, smirked as he cuffed him. "Sure it isn't. You're under arrest for illegal possession of a firearm." Elena rushed to the door, clutching the frame, tears streaking her face as they shoved Daniel into a cruiser. Neighbors peered from windows, phones already recording. "Told you he was trouble," a woman muttered from her porch, shaking her head. Linda watched from a block away, leaning against an unmarked car, her arms crossed, a smug twist to her lips. She'd flipped the script, and Daniel was sinking fast. "Enjoy the spotlight now," she whispered to herself, turning to leave as the sirens faded into the distance. 3 weeks later, Daniel sat in the Fulton County Courthouse, his hands cuffed, his Navy suit slightly wrinkled, but his face a mask of calm determination. The past weeks had been a whirlwind. False charges, planted evidence, and a relentless smear campaign orchestrated by Linda and her corrupt allies. Linda sat at the prosecution's table, her smirk firmly in place, confident she'd buried him. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Judge Hart banged her gavel. "This court is now in session. Mr. Harris, you stand accused of assaulting an officer, illegal possession of a firearm, and inciting violence. How do you plead? Daniel stood, his voice ringing clear. Not guilty, Your Honor, and I have evidence to prove it. The room erupted in murmurs. Linda's smirk faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to delay justice, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. But Daniel's lawyer, Tanya Brooks, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for dismantling crooked cops, stepped forward with a USB drive. This footage was captured by a hidden camera in Mr. Harris's car, she said, handing it to the judge. It shows the truth, and something far more damning. Judge Hart inserted the drive into her computer, and the room fell silent as the footage played on a large screen mounted above the bench. The video showed Linda planting the gun in Daniel's trunk, her face unmistakable as she smirked and muttered, "This'll teach him to mess with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a shout from the back. "Shame on you, Carter!" Linda's face turned ashen, her hands gripping the table. But the footage didn't stop there. It cut to a grainy clip of Linda and Victor Rollins in a dimly lit precinct hallway, their voices low but clear. "We'll bury him," Victor said, his tone cold and calculating. "No one's going to believe a black man over us. Make it stick, Linda." She nodded, a grim smile on her face. "Oh, it'll stick." The courtroom exploded in chaos. Shouts of outrage, scattered applause. "Liar!" a woman yelled, pointing at Linda. Judge Hart banged her gavel repeatedly, her voice rising. "Order! Order in this court." She turned to the bailiffs. "Officer Carter, Deputy Chief Rollins, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit a felony. Take them into custody." Linda's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic as bailiffs approached. "This is a setup," she screamed, thrashing against the cuffs. "He's lying. He's a criminal." Victor glared at her, hissing, "Shut up, you idiot," as they were dragged out. No one was listening to her protests. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to make a statement." Judge Hart nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Proceed, Mr. Harris." Daniel took a deep breath, his voice steady but resonant with quiet strength. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. Linda Carter and Victor Rollins thought they could silence me, break me, because of who I am, because of the color of my skin. But they underestimated the power of truth. Today, justice isn't just served for me. It's served for every man, woman, and child who's ever been targeted, harassed, or framed. This is a victory for all of us." The courtroom erupted again, this time in thunderous applause. Some spectators rose to their feet, clapping fiercely. A man in the back shouted, "That's right, Daniel." Elena, seated in the front row, wiped away tears of relief, her hands trembling. Tanya placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with pride. Daniel walked out of the courthouse a free man, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the steps. A crowd of supporters greeted him, holding signs that read "Justice for Daniel" and "End Police Corruption." Jamal, the young activist, stood at the front, pumping a fist in the air. "We got your back, man," he called out. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust in Daniel's face. "Mr. Harris, what's next for you?" one asked, her camera rolling. Daniel looked directly into the lens, his eyes burning with determination. "This is just the beginning. I'm going to use my voice to fight for systemic change. No one should have to go through what I did. Starting with the Harris Act. Mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, and real accountability for every officer. It's time to make justice blind, not biased." Months later, Daniel became a leading voice in the fight against police corruption and racial injustice. His case sparked nationwide protests and legislative reforms, including the Harris Act, signed into law after relentless pressure from grassroots movements he helped inspire. Linda Carter and Victor Rollins were sentenced to 15 years each, their careers and reputations reduced to ash. Daniel and Elena moved to a quieter neighborhood north of Atlanta, a place where Mia could ride her bike without the echo of sirens. But he never stopped fighting, partnering with organizations like the NAACP and speaking to victims of police misconduct across the country. At a rally in downtown Atlanta 6 months later, Daniel stood before a sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all holding signs demanding change. Beside him, Mia clutched a homemade poster, Superhero Daddy, the words scrawled in bright red marker. The crowd roared as he took the microphone. "This isn't my victory, it's ours," he said. "Every step we take together tears down the walls of injustice. We're not done yet." A chant rose up, "Harris, Harris," and he felt Elena's hand slip into his, warm and steady. As for Linda, she spent her days in a cold prison cell, the gray walls closing in. She thought she was untouchable, a queen in her own mind. But the truth, in Daniel Harris, had toppled her throne. In the silence, she replayed her choices, her smirk long gone, replaced by the bitter sting of defeat. Lesson learned from the story. The story of Daniel Harris teaches us a powerful lesson. Resilience and truth can triumph over even the darkest injustices. It shows that no matter how stacked the odds seem, whether it's corruption, prejudice, or a system built to silence you, one person's courage to stand up can spark a revolution. Daniel didn't just fight for himself. He fought for everyone who's ever been wronged, proving that justice isn't handed out, it's demanded. The takeaway? Never give up, even when the world bets against you, because the truth has a way of breaking through. Meaningful message conveyed. This story delivers a message that hits hard. Real change starts with us. It's about the power of holding those in authority accountable and the strength found in community. People like Daniel, Elena, and even Jamal, who rallied together to expose corruption. It's a call to action, reminding us that systemic flaws like racism and abuse of power don't fix themselves. They crumble when we shine a light on them. At its core, it's a testament to hope, that even in our toughest battles, standing tall and speaking out can rewrite the ending. Personal perspective on the story. From my view, Daniel Harris is more than a character. He's a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to let fear win. I'm blown away by how he turned pain into purpose, taking a personal nightmare and transforming it into a movement that changed lives. Linda Carter's downfall? That's karma in action, a reminder that arrogance and corruption eventually catch up with you. This story gets me fired up because it's not just about one man's victory. It's about all of us and how we can rise together to demand better. It's raw, real, and inspiring as hell. Loved this roller coaster of a tale? Then you've got to stick around for more. Subscribe to Story Precious right now and hit that bell icon so you never miss a single video. We're bringing you the latest stories, packed with drama, heart, and lessons that stick with you, hot off the press. Join our growing crew of story lovers, and let's keep the conversation going. Hit that subscribe button for Story Precious and be the first to catch every epic drop.